In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Blood Dragon build, which is sort of a combination between the Bloodblade and the Dragon Priest build, and functions somewhere in the middle between the two. If you've been looking for a good Arcane build, then this guide is for you. Note that I will be showing footage from the Liurnia of the Lakes, Raya Lucaria Academy, and the Software River areas of the game, so if you don't want to be spoiled on those, then you probably don't want to watch any further. The first thing you're going to need for this build is 2 curved swords, or really 2 weapons, any 2 weapons that you want. But faster weapons are better for this build because you're going to get bleed build up much quicker when you can strike faster. So I like the curved swords, and the warrior begins the game with them, which is why I chose them. And you're going to want to put the Ash of War Bloody Slash on either of them, and the way you do that is you get the Lost Ashes from the merchant in the southwest part of Weeping Peninsula, and then you go to the blacksmith and duplicate Bloody Slash so you can put one on either one. You then want to select the bleed affinity so that they each have bleeding, and this is going to make it so that when you attack with both weapons with L1, that you set the bleeding status effect. If you saw the Bloodblade build, you should be familiar with this already. The next thing you're going to want is the Dragon Communion seal that's found below the very start of the game there, that drops from the Banished Knight in the sort of Fringe Folk Heroes grave area. And the reason this is good for this build is that it uses Somber Stones. You're going to need all the smithing stones you got to upgrade both your blades. And it also boosts Dragon Communion incantations or Dragon incantations, which you're going to use for this build. The other thing that's really good about the Dragon Communion seal is that it scales with Arcane, and it does so excellently, meaning that the more Arcane you pump, the more your spells are going to deal in terms of damage. And it's also the stat needed to increase how fast blood buildup occurs with bleed, so that's why we want it for scimitars as well that have the bleed on them, so they set bleed more quickly. So you're not only going to be getting more damage out of your scimitars, you're not only going to be setting bleed more quickly by pumping Arcane, but you're also going to have more damage from your spells. In terms of armor, you can really use whatever you want here. You just want to use something that is basically kind of the heaviest you can use and still mid-roll. It's not going to be super heavy with this build because you don't have a ton of endurance, but it's going to be somewhere in that mid-roll range as long as you have decent protection. For talismans for this build, you're going to want the Blessed Dew Talisman, the Winged Sword Insignia, and Marika's Seal. The Blessed Dew Talisman is one of the best all-around talismans in the game, I feel like. And it's really good for this build because you're going to be using Bloody Slash, which is the weapon skill of the scimitar, and it takes health away when you use it. It consumes 60 HP per use, so that talisman is going to help replenish that little chip damage you take when using it. The Winged Sword Insignia increases your attack power for both weapons the more you attack. So the faster you attack and hit enemies, the more this is going to build up, and it gives you like a percentage of attack power each time you get to a certain threshold. I don't know exactly what the breakpoints are, but it seems to increase more and more the more hits you do, and it gets somewhere up to around like 20 or 22% from my testing at max stacks. And then what happens is over time, if you don't hit anything, you start losing stacks of it. And so like it doesn't all go away at once, it just goes down a little by little. So if you get back into combat quickly, which you're going to be trying to do because you're going to be trying to inflict bleed with this build, then you should be able to maintain it at least some stacks throughout the fight. And the last talisman we're going to use here is Marika's Seal. This is going to increase your Mind, Intelligence, Faith, and Arcane. Of the 4 of those stats, we need 3 of them, which is Mind, Faith, and Arcane. This is an extremely stat-hungry build, meaning you need Vigor, you need Mind, you need Endurance, you need Faith, you need Arcane, and even Dexterity would benefit this build. So what this does is it alleviates some of that stat spread, allowing us to meet the requirements for things like Faith and get that Mind we need, which we need to get to 15, and I'll explain a bit later. So it's going to free up some attribute points this early in the game in order to get where you want to be faster. Probably later in the game, you're going to remove this because you'll have a lot more attribute points to play around with, because it increases the damage you take by about 5%. But that's not a huge amount, and for this point of the game, it does us really, really well. The 2 spells we use for this build are Dragon Claw and Rotten Breath. Both of these are dragon incantations, and you're going to have to kill 2 dragons in order to get them. There's one in the beginning of the game, and then there's one in Liurnia, so you should be able to get them. But you're going to have to make your way all the way over to the Cathedral of Dragon Communion in Caelid in order to get Rotten Breath. You don't need to kill anything, you just need to ride over there in order to be able to exchange it for Rotten Breath, though you can get Dragon Claw much early on in the game. So what I really love about this build is it has so many different options of things it can do. It can go on the offensive with L1 and build up bleed very, very quickly on enemies that are susceptible to bleed and absolutely devastate them like human-type enemies or, living enemies like dogs, etc. Very, very good against those type of enemies. You also have Bloody Slash, which does absolutely incredible damage. The damage on that ability increases with the weapon upgrade and also the Arcane stat. I can confirm that Arcane does increase Bloody Slash's damage for each point you spend, and it doesn't even matter what affinity you choose. So even if you're playing on a different build and you have Keen, you're still going to get points on Bloody Slash for Arcane, so it works best on Arcane builds, what this is. One of the things I really love about Bloody Slash is it only costs 6 FP, which is ridiculously cheap. And also, it ducks down when you swing. So a lot of times, even if you're like really close to enemies, they'll swing right over the top of your head, and you'll come up with a slash absolutely devastating them if you time it correctly. Besides your L1 attacks and Bloody Slash, you also have Dragon Claw. Dragon Claw is there for very difficult enemies. What I really love about Dragon Claw is that it has like really, really good poise, like super armor, and it'll basically tank through just about anything. It's super expensive at 42 FP per, which is why we have exactly 84 FP, because you can cast it once, and then if you hit R1 again quickly, you'll do a second like swipe down faster than the first one. So that'll consume exactly 84 FP, so you can do this once before you need to drink a pot, you know, do that whole combo. It works really, really well against turtly enemies that have like big shields that you normally can't get through with your tiny scimitars or that block your breath attacks. So it's really, really good against those sort of enemies or big enemies you just want to take down really quickly. Like it'll drop a troll if you hit it with that combo, or like maybe a golem, it takes off tons and tons of damage. So you're not going to use it very often, but there are situations where it's absolutely devastating. And Rotten Breath is just absolutely broken with this build. Like, it's just absolutely broken in general, I feel like. This is something that you're going to lead boss fights with, or you can cast from horseback against large enemies out on the landscape. And the damage of it, like, doesn't deal a ton of damage. It's like, it'll clear big mobs of enemies, or big packs of mobs, rather. But it excels at absolutely dealing damage to bosses over time. Like, if you can get this off on a boss, like, right away, like Renala or any other boss, you're going to have such an easy time with that boss, because like, it'll clear half their health bar without any other attacks while you're doing the rest of your attacks. So you absolutely want to use this for difficult enemies. Maybe it's enemies you don't want to get close to because they just deal so much damage and you don't know how to approach them. Use this first, get that dot onto them, and then figure out your strategy. What's also great about it is it's not bleeding. So if like maybe an enemy is immune to bleeding, they're maybe not be immune to Scarlet Rot. So it's good in that sense as well. Talking about the stats for this build, as I mentioned, it's extremely stat hungry. You have quite a substantial stat spread. You need 20 vigor in order to have health. This is important because you're going to need health to use Bloody Slash because it takes 60 HP per use. You're also going to need it for when you use Dragon Claw because you'll probably get hit through that attack and you want to live, and you're playing a melee build so you will get hit. As I mentioned a minute ago, you need exactly 15 mind at least in order to get 84 FP. This will give you the double swipe of Dragon Claw exactly before you need to drink a pot. If you have any less than that, you can only do one swipe, and you want to be able to do two. As far as endurance goes, somewhere around 20 is good. I have 33 Arcane and 17 endurance here, but you could easily have 30 Arcane and 20 endurance. You use a lot of stamina with this build between all the different things you do. Rolling and attacking with dual wield tends to consume more stamina than attacking with a single slash. So you can use that extra stamina, and giving you a little bit more equip weight will allow you to wear a little bit heavier armor, which will protect you more as well. We don't really increase strength or dexterity at this point. The dexterity is actually from the class from being a warrior, but if you use a different class, this might be lower. You only really need the dexterity at this point to meet the requirements for the weapons, but you'll probably start pumping dexterity closer to later on in the game in order to increase the damage with your weapons. As far as faith goes, you need at least 17 to use Dragon Claw, and you need 15, I think, in order to use Rotten Breath. So that's your breakpoint, 17. You don't want to go any higher than that at this point in the game. Faith does boost your damage with these spells because the Dragon Communion Seal does have scaling with Faith, but it scales better with Arcane, and Arcane also benefits your weapons, so you want to prioritize Arcane. Later on in the game, if you're still playing this build, there's going to be other Dragon spells you probably want that have higher faith requirements, and you'll probably need to go up a little bit in faith in order to meet those, but you don't want to go any higher than you have to. And lastly, we have the most important stat for this build, which is Arcane. It improves the damage of Bloody Slash, it improves the damage of your weapons outright, it improves the rate at which they build up enemies' bleed bars, and it improves the damage that you do with your spells. So it's very, very important for this build, and you're going to continue to crank this throughout the course of the game. A couple other things I want to mention about this build before I end this video is that the Roar Talisman doesn't actually improve the breath attacks of dragon spells, so we don't use it in this build. I've tested this with multiple dragon breath abilities, and it doesn't affect them in my testing, so I don't recommend using this talisman. Another thing is learn to use Bloody Slash often. Bloody Slash is so good with this build, and it's really good during boss fights if you can learn to get the timing down. It's really, really strong. You're not using it really for the blood build-up. You're just using it for the damage, and it's probably one of the strongest weapon skills in the game for the amount of FP it costs at 6, which is ridiculously low. Another thing is that Marika's Seal gives you +3 to Faith, it gives you +3 to Arcane, and it gives you +3 to Mind as well as Intelligence, though we don't need Intelligence. So factor that into the numbers that I mentioned. For instance, Mind, you only need 12 Mind if you're using this because it takes you up to 15, and you only need 14 Faith if you're using this because it takes you up to 17. And yes, it does meet the requirements of the spell, so that works fine. And the last thing that I want to mention is that if you have a choice between upgrading one weapon, like your primary right-hand weapon, and both of your weapons evenly, you should prioritize upgrading your right-hand weapon because it's going to increase your Bloody Slash damage because that's going to be based on your right-hand weapon. So if you can either upgrade 2 weapons to +8 or 1 to +7 and the other one to +10, do the +10 in the right hand and the +7 in the left hand. That way your Bloody Slash deals maximum damage.